Welcome to Street Smart Wisdom. Today's conversation is with Harville Hendrix and Helen Hunt, and it's a distinct pleasure and honor to have these two world-class thinkers and writers as a guest on our program. So today we're going to find out a little bit about where they come from and, you know, your lineage. So who are you guys and where do you come from?
What is our lineage? Well, so we can go way back to growing up on a farm as a sharecropper's son, and being a part early, for me, moving from the farm to the town, becoming a part of a church, and eventually becoming a minister, and moving to seminary, graduate theological education, and finally into clinical practice as a couples therapist, developing Imago relationship therapy. Met Helen, and we began to co-create in our conversations the background for what became Imago relationship therapy that got translated in 1988 into a book, Getting a Love You Want, a guide for couples. And so that's sort of the trajectory. And then we moved recently to expand our work from therapy to social transformation. So maybe Helen can pick up on that and talk about your background.
A little bit about me. I was born on the opposite side of the tracks in a mansion. My father discovered the East Texas oil field. I didn't like the mansion, didn't like wealth. I wanted to be a therapist. I wanted to be a Jungian analyst. But money, as an adult, I got distributions from the company, and I had to be a, quote, responsible shareholder. So I had to fund things, and you don't do that as a psychologist. So I spent time in the women's movement, funding women's voices and women's equality. But my heart is all about helping Harville with his idea of getting therapy out of the offices and into the world, because we're all about social transformation.
Yeah. Well,
and I've always been a behind-the-scenes support.
Well, she says I've been behind-the-scenes support, but the fact is, and I say fact accurately, is that Imago would not have come into being without Helen. She's been indispensable to the development of the clinical therapy couple side, and a co-creator of it and a co-producer of it. And we've been working together now as partners in the distribution of it actively for about 15 years. And then prior to that, there was more. She was involved in other projects, some, but always involved some in this. So we come from very different backgrounds, but met in Dallas. Helen, a student of graduate of SMU. I was a professor at SMU. So we have those intersections, and we have 6 children. We each inherited 2, and then we had 2, so it gave us 6, and we now have 7 grandchildren. And they're all doing well at this point.
Thank God, that's beautiful.
Yes.
So you mentioned Jung, but who are some of your influences? And shifting it, what are some of your, I mean, you mentioned it earlier, you want to kind of, what do you say, get therapy out of the therapy rooms and into the world. So what motivates you guys and, you know, to keep moving this forward, and what has been some of the catalysts?
I sort of like Harville to go first, but in any interview, but I'm going to jump in. Since I mentioned Jung, one of Jung's ideas was it's important to hold the tension of the opposites. That to go into higher consciousness, if there's something that you don't like, or if there's a relationship that's really troubled, like, don't leave, like, stay in there and learn to work with that. And your brain and your consciousness will move to a higher level. And that's exactly what Harville would begin to say about marriage. The grounds for marriage is incompatibility, because everybody, you're drawn to someone different than you, and you're going to end up feeling a lot of pain with that person. You're unconsciously drawn to someone who's going to make you miserable. So when we were dating, he had 3 steps of marriage. The first is romance, the second is the power struggle, and the third was real love. And everybody in stage 1, the period of romance, ends up in the power struggle. And the question is, can you get to the stage 3? So I just think I'll mention that, plus the feminist psychologist, Carol Gilligan, and others were an influence about, we don't need a mental health field that is about the within, that really having healthy relationships is what women want to have mental health, not separation, autonomy, self-sufficiency, that we really are interdependent.
The background for both of us, I think, given Jung and given that you were also influenced by Bob and Mary Goulding and transactional analysis, there's a way both of us can root and who was Jung's nemesis, the young protege? Hillman.
Yeah.
That both of us can claim, and me especially, being shaped by the psychoanalytic tradition. I was trained by psychoanalysts in my early clinical work, did 12 years of psychoanalysis on myself. And I say with some dejection that it didn't help very much, but I at least learned I learned a lot about my neurosis, but I didn't change it very much. So the exploration side. And then we began to pay attention, because we went into couples therapy, which is has the dynamics of how do they interact with each other and how they treat each other, began to grow less interested in what was going on inside them than we were in what was going on between them. And so we shifted from what would be called parallel psychotherapy type of couples therapy to what we would call now a relational couples therapy, in which the therapist doesn't work with the couples individually, but facilitates the couple working with each other and dialogically and dialectically. So we sort of move from the vertical expert helping the couple to facilitating at a linear level, the couple helping themselves. And that began to, wasn't fully formed when Getting the Love You Want was written in 1988, but it was on the way, because we began to use words like connection instead of insight and self-understanding, interaction rather than intrapsychic. But now we have fully moved conceptually to a purely relational model that's no longer dependent on the relational derivatives of psychology, but has shifted to, and because those derivatives are rooted in Newtonian physics and in the atomistic self, we've moved now to what would be called quantum field theory, where the ground for thinking about relationship is actually rooted in nature and has its scientific support and articulation in quantum field theory. So looking at human beings now through the new eyes of not Newton and the individual, but quantum and the interconnectivity of the universe, we've evolved the couples therapy of Imago to what we call a couples theory, couples theory and therapy based upon a cosmology of connecting, so that the local is the conduit for the cosmic, and that it is, and there's no other doorway. We can't say you can go to the cosmos and come to the local, because we don't know how to do that, but we do know how to start where we are. And if you stay there and create, as Helen said, a particular kind of relationship, which is basically safe, then you drop your defenses and you begin then to experience vulnerability. That vulnerability leads to connecting, and when you connect personally, that connection personally also connects you cosmically, so that we are all living in an interconnecting universe, but we don't feel that way because we're alienated from each other. But when that alienation turns into connecting, then we experience the connecting locally and globally. And we have been listening to couples talk. They intuitively want that. They intuitively know that that's real, but our culture has not given us a language to talk about relationship. It's only giving us a language to talk about the self.
So couples intuitively want what? I
They
missed
want
that.
connecting, and they want that feeling that they belong to each other and to something larger. But if you focus only on the self and it understanding itself and getting better, you don't get the connecting, interactive, interconnecting part and the sense of belonging. You get better understanding, you get better insight, you take care of yourself better, but you don't improve the quality of what we call the space between, which is the interactive space. It's another term that has evolved here and comes from Helen's borrowing from Martin Buber in the I-thou relationship. The hyphen between the I and the thou has basically become a foundational piece in our new work, that for marriage, it's all about the relationship. It's not about you. When you make it about the relationship, you get served. If you make it about you, the relationship suffers and you suffer. So we moved in. That's why we're moving toward a purely relational model in which the relationship is the client and the relationship is should be the focus of the couple. And when they do that, paradoxically, they get what they want. But if they focus on themselves, what they get is a conflicted relationship and an atrophied relationship. So that's sort of a quick run through of 30 years of theoretical evolution. And then we said, well, you know what? About 10 years ago, therapy will never change the world because therapy only fixes what was broken. So we need to begin to working on seeing if we can go upstream and fix the broken world, and then we may not have so many broken couples. So that's when we moved what we learn works in the clinic with couples into the public, because the dialogical process is not couple specific. It actually is a human process. It's just not practiced, because we humans practice monologue, i.e. I'm talking, you listen, and that produces inequality and conflict. So we move into dialogue, which is a lateral way of talking, makes both people equal and therefore safe. You get a whole different quality in your relationship, and you have a methodological transformation that produces transformations in each other as a result of changing the space between.
Yeah, those are some interesting distinctions, that the client you're working with is not a husband and wife, it's the relationship.
It's the relationship, right?
And that's profound. That's it sounds like minuscule, but it's a significant distinction.
It sort of turns the Freudian analytic tradition that shaped both of us all the way around and says, hey, instead of starting inside, why don't we start in the space between? Because if we change that, since the inside is basically made up of the internalization of experience called memory, if we change what you do in the interactive space, you get new memories. So you change the inside faster by changing the outside. Go inside, you may learn a lot about yourself. Go outside and you can change yourself. So it is a radical shift and is sort of a reversal of the analytic tradition. But when you pick up on, well, the client becomes the relationship for the couple, we've also said, well, that client needs to also be the culture that produces that couple. So now our social work, we're making the culture our client, and extending the space between to culture itself. So anyway, I don't know if any of that makes sense, but it was.
So you're making, so is that part of Safe Conversations?
That's Safe Conversations.
Is
Yes.
towards a culture. Now, how do you, okay, really stupid question. How do you fix a culture?
Well, that's a question we have no answer to, but so we made one up. You always have to imagine before you can act. So we've made it up. And so, Helen's is my inspiration for going to cultural transformation, because she spent so many years in the women's movement, which was about cultural transformation. The way you fix a culture, we have posited, is that you have to start locally and go globally. So we found locally what works for couples is dialogue, which we rebranded as Safe Conversation, so that you help people create a safety in their interactions, and then they relax enough. And here's the major thing, is that they can then connect and communicate about and beyond their differences. Now, difference is what creates cultural conflict. Right now, we have difference going on everywhere with various groups disagreeing with the other group. In other words, differences is sort of we call it the function of the symbiotic consciousness, where you want other people to see the world the way you see it, and to act the way you act, to value what you value, and do what you do. So we decided that if we could take dialogue, rebrand it as Safe Conversation, and teach it on a mass scale, that we would begin to impact the structure of institutions. And we're finding that to be true. We've been in Dallas now about 5 years, and in a citywide project that has gone global. We've gone from Dallas to 18 countries and 37 states, in which people are lining up to learn the Safe Conversations process, because every time a group comes and gets it and uses it, they experience a radical change in their ecosystem, whether it's their couple or family, school. Helen, as you've been talking about, a woman who's taking it into governmental organizations in Florida, companies, and so forth, are all finding that when you move to a relational culture, everybody thrives. And they move because they move out of a competitive culture. And competition is what Western civilization has been doing for the past 250 years. Now we need to move to relationship, collaboration, cooperation, and co-creation. So those are the values and methodologies that we're bringing to the culture. And we figure once you reach a tipping point in helping people connect, get to a tipping point, then you flip the whole system. And we figured it'll take about 40 to 70 years to do this.
Wow, that's profound. I love that.
Helen, I just rambled on there. Helen is, the reason all this is working is Helen is not only a master co-creator of theory and therapy and operational practices, but she, having been one of the leading women in the women's movement for about 30 years, learned how to create an organization that embodies a value system and can distribute that value system. So she is running Relationships First, which is our not-for-profit, building its staff, building its financial resources, providing a lot of those financial resources. And we're now on the verge of going from an analog delivery system to a digital one. So in about 3 months, we'll probably be on a digital platform, and then we'll have global reach.
That's quite exciting, and glad to be in the loop as you guys move forward. So to finish this section, I have a question that I sometimes ask. So let's take a crack at it.
Okay.
Usually it works. We can start with either of you. If you were a superhero, what would your creation myth be? You know, what was the catalyst that set you on this path?
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I've been talking so long. Why don't you pick up on that? you were a superhero, what would your creation myth be? In other words, what
Creation story, the story, what gave you the impetus or what turned on a light bulb or some that set you on this course?
Is it Leonard Cohen, the crack? Do you remember that song? Write down Leonard Cohen. That.
Oh, I know Leonard Cohen. Which song?
Yeah. Well, the vase gets cracked, and that's where the light comes in.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I forget the name of his song, but that in a way, I could imagine us as all pots. They were all a lump of clay because we're
okay.
Earth. And so what's the vase going to look like? What's going to happen with this lump of clay that's you? And I think the important thing to know is it's not the victories or the things you do right, but sometimes your greatest learning comes from stumbling, and you fall down and break your knee, and that going up the ziggurat, it's a step at a time, and then you think you're getting there, and then oops, the wind comes and you fall back like 10 steps or even more, and so you have to get up again and you keep going. So there's something. I'll say one more thing. One time, Harville, the wisdom of Imago is that we have a childhood wound, and we're drawn to somebody who has a wound similar to our wound, and the job is for two people learn to heal each other's childhood wounds. And you can think of that. So I did one time a little work with words that I don't say hardly ever, but the childhood wound can be seen as a HOLE, a hole in our psyche. Like most of our psyche works, but then there's a big hole because we're wounded. But if you hold the wound in the right way, according to Imago theory, or two people learning to heal each other's wound, they can become whole, WHOLE.
I like that.
For me, that is holy work, HOLY. So there's my myth, that if you want to be holy, like you really have to deal with the HOLE, the part of you that got cracked.
Mm-hmm.
That's beautiful.
So I'd love to hear you say a little bit more, because that's sort of the outcome, but what motivated you to do it? Because you didn't have to do anything. You were wealthy and you could have eaten bonbons on the south of France, but you didn't. And maybe you don't want to say anything about that, but what gave birth to you in our work right now? I'm asking because I don't think we've talked about that.
I just think I saw other people suffering.
Saw other people suffering.
And I saw that first in Dallas. Dallas is, quote, the tale of two cities. There's a wealthy part of Dallas and there's a poor part of Dallas. And I was going crazy that I was living in a mansion and I went to an all-girls school and it was all white people. I have a friend, Harville, who said he moved to Dallas 5 years ago. He lives in North Dallas, and for 4 of the 5 years, quote, he never saw a person of color. That's today.
Wow.
It's all white people. And when I went to college, I wanted to teach school in the low income part of, in South Dallas, the poverty area. I didn't dream I could ever be a therapist or have a profession. This was in the 70s, I think 1970s. Yeah. So women were supposed to go to college to get an MRS degree. In Dallas, I should be a mother, I should be a homeworker, a homemaker. So, but at least I got a teacher's degree and I taught in South Dallas. And it's, but wanting to fix their wounds, I discovered I had so many wounds of my own.
Okay, so it was seeing the sufferings of others that motivated you to try to get out of the rich, privileged environment and do something
jump into
sort of
the
close
sea
that
of
discrepancy.
humanity. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, but there's also another story where you discovered that wealthy women had no power over their resources,
Mhm.
and you wanted to give a voice to, and I don't want to speak for you, but I
Mhm.
think that was another one I'm more familiar with. The birthing experience was, I'm rich, and you had to acquire power over your inheritance. And then you found that all of your wealthy friends, and therefore by deduction, most wealthy heiresses, didn't have any control over their money.
Mhm.
And so the goal was to help them find a way to not, what is the word you used to be shackled, golden
Oh,
handcuffs?
yeah.
Have golden
Yeah.
handcuffs.
Golden handcuffs. You couldn't do anything
Couldn't
if
do-
you were rich.
If
But
you were
anyway,
rich.
I don't want the time to run out
So
without
that's
you.
her history is so amazing, and what she did with that was to become this, probably, she don't like me to say it, but I think it's true, so I'm going to say it. She's probably in the top 3 leading women, people in the feminist movement in the world, and has contributed more in terms of directing funds to the women's movement. In fact, she started a parallel women's philanthropic movement to the women's movement itself. The movement needed money. They didn't have any. Helen created a mechanism called Women Moving Millions that drove millions of dollars to fund women and girls across the world. So, and for that, she's now enshrined in the Smithsonian Institute, and previous to that was installed in the Women's Hall of Fame. So
I worked with a lot of other women for that
as she
time.
always says, well, it was the other
What a
women.
proud husband.
Watched her leadership of doing, she may work with them, but she was leading them and the head of the pack. So, so what gave birth to me, I think, and I've often wondered, how come I'm so driven? I'm 84 years old, and I don't need to be out here anymore, but I can't leave. And I wonder, people say, you can just quit. And I say, well, you might can, but I don't know how to quit, because the world's still burning. I think what gave birth to me was, I actually think it was the death of both of my parents before I was 6 years old.
Wow.
Structures became unpredictable, and that somehow I needed to repair that for me, and therefore you need to repair for the world. And I, early on, by 17, 15, I went into the church. By 17, I was an ordained minister and pastor of a modest, a small town church, and then went, and so I became an evangelist in that situation. I was a rather successful youth evangelist in preaching, Jesus and the New Testament, or preaching Southern theology, Georgia Baptist theology. But it was successful. And I remember I had this passion for people to know something they didn't know, to change to a better life, not knowing what was driving me to do that at 15. Why wasn't I, or at 17, why was I running a church when I could have been dating and smooching with girls and all kinds of things? So I wind up going to graduate school after college, going to graduate school in New York at Union Theological, and deciding I want to be a professor and teach ministers rather than be on the front lines. And in the process of getting prepared for that, I went into pastoral care and counseling. That trained me to be a clinician. And so I got that, and I found out I was a really good clinician, because I had a practice as big as the space I had, which was small when I was a professor at Perkins School of Theology for a decade. Then they fired me because I got a divorce in 1975. They said it's because I hadn't written, but it was interesting that it came 3 months after my divorce. I was told, you're no longer on the tenure track, so we'll give you 3 years to find a new job, which was generous. But I discovered that being on a faculty wasn't very inspiring to me, and so it was almost a blessing in disguise to be fired because I went into clinical practice and became, again, very successful in clinical practice. That led to a research question Helen and I came up with called Why Do Couples Fight? And which led us to a project where the answer was because they can't tolerate difference. It's simply that, they can't tolerate difference. So they try to annihilate each other so that everything will be the same. And I know you can add a lot of things to that, like we don't have sex, we don't hold hands, but it's all has to do with objection to difference. And so we wrote the book, Getting the Love You Want, in 1988. Oprah picked it up, and we became then visible. Actually, the book became visible. The book got more famous than we became because I had 18 exposures on the Oprah show over a 20-year period, which is nobody can buy that. You just, that's handed to you. I think you have to take it, which we did, but it was handed to us. So I think the push has been to transform the world. And that book, when it went on Oprah, gosh, this was another opening into huge influence. Now it's 4 million readers, which ain't a bad run. And then along the way, married to Helen, and it was interesting. Her interest was in psychology. My interest grew toward social change. And we began to co-influence each other about how to do that. So that finally led then to a joint project called Relationships First as the organization, distributing Safe Conversation as the methodology on a digital platform. And our market is 7.8 billion people, because all we want to do is develop relational competence so that people can talk without pissing each other off.
Wow, I need a copy of that, actually. I can use a copy of that for sure. So that was a great session. And so how can people find you? What's your website again? Well,
HelenandHarville.com will get you to our website, and then there are links to Safe Conversations and to the Imago Therapy website from ours.
all right. Well, that was excellent. Any last words for this section?
I think you should save them if they are.
Okay, so that was brilliant. We learned a lot, and I think that it's great context for people to know more about you in the small scheme of things and in the larger scheme of things. So thank you very much.